The battle is over. The noise has stopped. Where there were 10,000 men screaming, there is now just wind moving through the grass, and the grass is the wrong color. You are a peasant from a village whose name nobody outside that village has ever bothered to learn. You have survived. You are bleeding from somewhere, but it does not seem fatal. And stretched out in front of you, as far as you can see in the failing afternoon light, is a field covered in bodies. Some of those bodies are wearing things worth more money than you will earn in 20 years of your life. And believe me, some of the men standing in that field with you are already doing the math. So the question is simple, even if the answer is not. What do you do next? This is not a hypothetical. This scene repeated itself hundreds of times across medieval Europe, from the wheat fields of northern France, to the bogs of Scotland, to the sun-baked plains of Castile. Battles ended, men died, and in the hours that followed, other men made decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. Some of those men were knights. Some were noblemen with legal claims to everything in sight, and some were ordinary people with no claims at all, who understood perfectly well that the distance between poverty and something better was sometimes nothing more than the willingness to bend down and start unbuckling. The thing to understand about the medieval economy is that wealth did not live in banks. It did not sit in portfolios or accumulate in accounts. Wealth was physical. It was land, livestock, grain, and above all, it was objects. Specific, precious, irreplaceable objects. A silver cup, a bolt of fine Flemish cloth, a trained hunting falcon. And, at the very top of the list, in a category almost by itself, a knight's armor. Not because armor was decorative, though some of it was extraordinarily beautiful, but because armor was functional, specialized, and produced by some of the most skilled craftsmen in Europe, getting your hands on a good harness was not like finding a coin in the street. It was more like stumbling across someone's entire pension fund, made of steel, lying face down in the mud, just waiting. The 1,374 estate inventory of Sir Robert Hawley, an English knight killed in a brawl inside Westminster Abbey of all places, listed his armor at a value exceeding his horses, his plate silver, and his furniture combined. Just the armor, one man's kit. And that was before anyone had thought carefully about the timing. By the 14th century, the technology of plate armor had reached a level of sophistication that made a complete harness genuinely expensive to produce, genuinely difficult to replace, and genuinely desirable to almost everyone who saw it. A suit of armor had a secondary market. It could be sold, repaired, resold, adapted, and sold again. Unlike a debt or a promise, it was undeniably, tangibly real. You could pick it up. You could feel the weight of it. And in a world where most transactions were still conducted in barter, where coinage was unreliable, and credit was for merchants and lords, something you could physically carry away from a battlefield represented a kind of financial opportunity that barely existed anywhere else in a peasant's world. So when we ask how a medieval peasant could retire on a dead knight's armor, we are not asking a frivolous question dressed up in historical costume. We are asking something quite serious about the economics of violence, the structure of medieval society, and the very narrow gaps through which ordinary people occasionally manage to climb. The armor is almost a metaphor. Almost, but not quite, because the armor was also extremely real and extremely heavy, and somebody had to carry it off the field before the Lord's men arrived to start asking whose it was. That somebody is what this story is about. Welcome to medieval madness. Before we can talk about what a peasant could do with a dead knight's armor, we need to talk about what that armor was actually worth. And to do that properly, we need to briefly set aside everything Hollywood has ever told us about medieval knights, which is quite a lot to forget. Instead, let's look at what a real harness meant to the man who owned it, and, more importantly, to the man who wanted to buy it. A full suit of plate armor in the 15th century, what the specialists called a harness, or a field of armor, was not a single object. It was a system. It was made up of somewhere between 20 and 40 individual pieces, depending on the style and the level of protection required, and every single one of those pieces had to fit the body of the man wearing it with a precision that modern tailoring would respect. A breastplate that rode too high would leave the armpits exposed. A helmet that sat too low would restrict vision at exactly the moment vision was most required. This was custom-made equipment produced by craftsmen who spent years learning their trade, working with metals that had to be heated, hammered, shaped, and tempered through processes that no two smiths quite agreed on. The result was that a complete harness from a top Italian or German workshop in the 1400s cost roughly the equivalent of a highly skilled worker's wages for 2 to 3 years. Some of the finest examples, fitted with elaborate decoration and produced in the celebrated workshops of Milan or Augsburg, ran to considerably more. To give that some texture, in 14th century England, a common labourer earned perhaps a penny or two a day. A skilled craftsman might earn 3 or 4 pence. A modest house in a provincial town could be had for around £2 or £3. And the quality harness, not an exceptional one, just a decent, functional, well-made suit of armour, might be valued at anywhere from £10 to £20 or more, depending on its completeness, its condition, and who had last worn it. For a labouring man, £20 was not a year's wages. It was closer to a decade's wages if he was careful and lucky and nothing went terribly wrong. So, a dead knight's armour. Suddenly, rather interesting. But here is the thing that makes this more interesting than a simple price tag. Armour did not have to be sold as a complete set. The market for individual pieces was thriving and well understood. A helmet alone, what the English called a bassinet or a sallet, depending on the style, could fetch between £1 and £3 for a quality example. A breastplate, the gorget or throat guard, had its own price. The gauntlets, the leg defences called greaves and sabatons, the arm defences called vambraces, all of it had a market, and all of it could be separated from the whole and sold to different buyers. A peasant who walked off a battlefield with a dead knight's complete harness was not obliged to find one buyer for the entire thing. He could, in theory, sell it piece by piece over time, which had its own advantages and its own complications. Then there was the question of condition. Armour taken from a battlefield had one obvious and unavoidable problem, which was that the man inside it had generally died in a way that left marks. Swords, axes, poleaxes, crossbow bolts, and early firearms all damaged the metal they were designed to penetrate. A dented breastplate was worth less than an intact one. But it was not worthless. The same guild of armourers who produced new harnesses also repaired old ones, and a skilled smith could do remarkable things with a piece of damaged plate, beating out dents, filling gaps, and refinishing surfaces to a standard that the original owner might have been grudgingly impressed by. Damaged armour, properly repaired, re-entered the market as serviceable equipment. The supply chain was circular in that way, and the demand was essentially constant, because wars were essentially constant. None of this was a secret. Everyone in medieval Europe who lived anywhere near military activity understood, in broad terms, what a suit of armour was worth. The peasants who lived near battle sites knew it, the merchants who travelled the roads between towns knew it, and the knights who wore the armour knew it, which is part of why the question of who owned the armour after a battle was so vigorously contested. A great deal of money was on the table. Very few people were inclined to leave it there. Looting the dead is one of the oldest human behaviours we have any record of. Not a comfortable thing to say out loud, maybe, but accurate. And the medievals would not have found it uncomfortable at all. For them, stripping a defeated enemy was not a shameful departure from civilized behaviour. It was, in many contexts, a recognised and even regulated part of what war was for. The instinct had a history, and the history had a name. The Romans called it spolia. The word simply means spoils in Latin, but it carried a weight of tradition behind it that went back to the earliest days of Roman military culture. When a Roman general dedicated the armour of an enemy commander he had killed in single combat to the temple of Jupiter Feretrius on the Capitoline Hill, this was not considered plunder. It was a sacred offering, a demonstration of martial virtue, and one of the highest honours a Roman general could achieve. The tradition was called the spolia opima, the rich spoils, and it was celebrated in Roman literature as the pinnacle of personal battlefield glory. The point is that taking the belongings of a man you had just defeated in war was, from a very early period in Western history, coded not as crime but as reward. The Germanic and Norse cultures that shaped medieval Europe's military values had their own versions of the same idea. In the sagas, stripping a fallen enemy of his weapons and armour was presented as a natural conclusion to victory. The sword of the defeated man passed to the man who killed him, and this transfer was understood to carry something beyond monetary value. It carried the reputation of its previous owner, for good or ill. A famous blade had a history, and owning it made you part of that history. The Vikings brought these attitudes south and west with them, and the cultures they encountered, traded with, and eventually blended into were not entirely different in their fundamental assumptions. By the High Middle Ages, but the idea that the victors were entitled to the belongings of the defeated was so thoroughly embedded in military culture that attempts to regulate it were largely attempts to direct the practice rather than to eliminate it. The feudal system of obligations meant that a knight's lord had certain claims on what his knight won in battle. A king had claims above those of his lords. The church had opinions about all of it, naturally. It always does. But running underneath all of these formal claims, like a current beneath ice, was the older and more basic assumption that a man who had risked his life in a fight had earned something from that fight, and that something included whatever the losing side left behind. This is where the peasant becomes interesting. Because the official frameworks of medieval battlefield law were designed to regulate the behavior of soldiers, knights, and noblemen, who were assumed to be the relevant actors in a military engagement. The peasant was not supposed to be there at all, or if he was there, he was supposed to be there in a specific and subordinate capacity. Camp follower, supply carrier, labourer, archer at best, not an independent agent with his own financial interests. The entire legal and moral architecture of battlefield spoils assumed a hierarchy of entitlement, and the peasant was at the bottom of it. He had, in theory, no entitlement whatsoever. In practice, of course, it was considerably more complicated than that. It always is. The same chronicles that describe the formal transfer of ransoms and the official distribution of captured equipment also contain, almost as background noise, references to the stripped and plundered state of battlefields, to bodies found entirely bare of clothing and equipment, to armor and weapons that seem to vanish between the ending of the fighting and the arrival of the official parties sent to account for it. Somebody was doing the stripping. Somebody was carrying the things away. The 13th century chronicler Matthew Paris, writing about the aftermath of the Battle of Luz in 1264, noted almost as an aside that the bodies of the fallen were found stripped bare before the official parties arrived to claim them. He did not seem particularly shocked, and the evidence, assembled carefully, points fairly consistently toward the people who were already there, who had the least to lose, and who understood perfectly well that the window between the end of a battle and the arrival of those with legal claims to everything was not going to stay open forever. The ancient right of spoils, in other words, had a gap in it large enough for an enterprising man to walk right through, and men walked through it constantly. Here is something that tends to surprise people. And honestly, it should. In medieval warfare, killing the enemy was frequently the worst financial decision a fighting man could make. Not morally the worst, not strategically the worst. Financially, a dead knight was worth the metal on his back. A live one was worth considerably more. And the system that had evolved to extract that value was one of the most sophisticated economic arrangements in medieval Europe. It had rules, customs, enforcement mechanisms, and, in the hands of the right man at the right moment, the power to fund a retirement more completely than any stripped harness ever could. The practice was ransom, and by the 14th century it had become so thoroughly institutionalized that it functioned less like a consequence of war and more like a financial instrument that war happened to produce. The basic principle was simple. If you captured a knight or nobleman alive on the battlefield, that man owed you a sum of money proportional to his rank and wealth in exchange for his freedom. The sums involved were not trivial. When King John II of France was captured by Edward the Black Prince at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the ransom eventually agreed upon was 3 million gold crowns. To put that in context, it was roughly twice the annual revenue of the entire French crown. France spent years trying to raise it, imposed special taxes across the realm, and never actually paid the full amount. John II, to his considerable credit and his kingdom's considerable expense, eventually returned to English custody voluntarily when his son, who had been left as a hostage, escaped. He died in London in 1364, a prisoner of his own sense of honour. That is an exceptional case, naturally. Most ransoms were not conducted at the level of kings. But the system operated at every level of the military hierarchy, and the proportionality was fairly consistent. A baron might fetch several £100, a wealthy knight 50 to 100. Even a minor gentleman of modest means was worth something to the man who held him, because the alternative, killing him outright, produced nothing beyond a body that still had to be stripped before it was useful. The ransom system converted the act of victory into a stream of income that could last months or years. It was patient money, in a world that was not generally patient about anything. The customs governing ransom were not written down in any single place, but they were widely understood and, more importantly, widely respected, because the system only functioned if both sides trusted it. A knight who broke the terms of his ransom agreement destroyed his own reputation, in a world where reputation was one of the few things that could not be looted or taxed. The 14th century chronicler Jean Froissart, who documented the wars of his era with an enthusiasm for financial detail that his editors presumably found exhausting, records dozens of ransom transactions with the matter-of-fact precision of a medieval accountant. He notes who captured whom, what sum was agreed, how it was paid, and occasionally, when things went wrong, what happened next. What happened next was generally not good for the man who had failed to honor the agreement. There was also a secondary market in ransom rights, which is where the system starts to feel genuinely modern in ways that are slightly unsettling. A soldier who captured a valuable prisoner did not always have the resources to house, feed, and guard that prisoner for the months or years it might take to arrange payment. So he could sell the ransom right to someone with more capital and better facilities. That someone might sell it again. By the time the ransom was actually paid, the original captor might have received his money years earlier, in a lump sum, at a discount, while the prisoner languished in a comfortable but firmly locked castle belonging to a man he had never met. I mean, structured financial products. In the 14th century, made of actual knights. And all of this operated entirely above the peasant's head, in a world of formal agreements and recognized obligations that assumed the participants were men of rank and standing. The peasant who found himself on a battlefield with a stunned and winded nobleman at his feet faced a choice that the ransom system's architects had not particularly designed for him. He could try to claim a ransom himself. He could try to sell the prisoner to someone who could. Or he could decide that the armor was a more reliable asset than an aristocrat's promise and start unbuckling. Each option had its logic, none of them was without risk, but some of them led to places that the peasant could not have reached any other way. Every battle in medieval Europe produced two events in sequence. The first was the battle itself, which has been written about extensively by chroniclers, military historians, and filmmakers with varying degrees of accuracy. The second was what happened in the hours immediately after the battle ended, which has been written about considerably less, partly because the people involved were not the kind of people who left written records, and partly because what they were doing was, depending on who you asked and when you asked them, somewhere between legally ambiguous and outright criminal. But it happened, reliably, after every engagement of any size. And it was, in its own quiet way, just as organized as the fighting that preceded it. The people who stripped medieval battlefields were not a single type. They came from several distinct groups, each with their own relationship to the field and their own place in the informal hierarchy of spoils. At the top, if top is the right word, were the soldiers themselves, the archers, infantrymen, and lower-grade men-at-arms who had fought the battle and believed, with reasonable justification, that they had earned something from it. Below them, or perhaps alongside them, were the camp followers, the servants, cooks, laundresses, and general attendants who accompanied medieval armies, and who occupied a position of such legal invisibility that even the chroniclers who mention them tend to do so in the passive voice, as though the stripping happened by itself. And then there were the opportunists, local villagers, traveling merchants, and professional scavengers, who had learned from long experience that a battlefield in the hours after fighting was one of the more reliable sources of portable wealth available to someone with no other obvious means of accessing it. The speed of the operation was remarkable. Contemporary accounts from battles including Crécy in 1346, Agincourt in 1415, and the various engagements of the Italian campaigns described fields that were substantially cleared of equipment within hours of the fighting stopping. At Agincourt, Henry V's army had barely finished securing their prisoners before the king issued his famous, and in this context, genuinely alarming, order that anyone found looting without authorization would be hanged. The order was issued not because looting had not yet begun, but because it very clearly had, and was proceeding at a pace that threatened to strip the field before the official distribution of spoils had been organized. The threat of hanging did slow things down, somewhat. Look, these were motivated people. The unofficial hierarchy of the strippers was enforced not by law but by physical reality. A man-at-arms who had fought all day and was still carrying his weapons had a considerable advantage over a camp follower with a knife and a sack. A group of soldiers who had agreed to share whatever they found in a particular section of the field could exclude others from that section by the simple method of being there first and being better. Armed. The peasants and villagers who arrived later, sometimes from several miles away after the news spread, found themselves working the margins, picking through what the soldiers had passed over or were not bothering to claim, which was still, on a large battlefield, quite a lot. What were they looking for, specifically? Everything, in principle, but there was a rough order of priority that everyone understood. Helmets first, because they were the most immediately identifiable and the most consistently valuable relative to their weight. Then breastplates and backplates, the core of any harness, heavy but worth the effort. Then the smaller pieces, gauntlets, arm defenses, foot defenses, which were lighter, easier to carry, and easier to conceal. Weapons came after armor in most calculations, because swords and poleaxes were plentiful, heavy, and somewhat easier to trace than unmarked pieces of plate. Clothing and personal items, rings, purses, belt fittings, were taken as a matter of course by everyone, including people who would have been genuinely offended at being called looters. Nobody was looting, they were just tidying up. The darkness helped enormously. Medieval battles typically ended in the late afternoon, and the serious stripping happened after sunset, when the legal claimants had retired to their tents and the men with torches and sacks moved in. The battlefield at night was its own world, with its own sounds and its own dangers, and not every figure moving through it in the dark was primarily interested in the armor. But enough of them were that by the time the official parties arrived in the morning to conduct their accounting, the discrepancy between the number of men known to have died and the quantity of equipment actually recovered was, in almost every documented case, considerable. The heralds sent to count the French dead at Agincourt on the morning of October 26, 1415, reported over 5,000 noble casualties. The equipment recovered by official parties amounted to a fraction of what 5,000 armoured knights should have produced. The gap between those two numbers had legs, and it had walked away before dawn. Medieval law had an answer to the question of who owned the possessions of a man who died on a battlefield. It had several answers, in fact, and they contradicted each other in ways that lawyers found professionally stimulating and that everyone else found maddening. The contradictions were not accidental. They were the sediment of centuries of competing claims, royal, feudal, ecclesiastical, and customary, layered on top of one another without anyone having the authority or the inclination to resolve them cleanly. What emerged was a system of battlefield property law that was simultaneously very detailed and almost entirely unenforceable at the level where it mattered most. Start with the king. In England, the crown's claim to battlefield spoils rested on the principle that the king was the ultimate source of all military authority, and therefore the ultimate beneficiary of military success. This claim had a specific legal expression in the concept of royal fifth, or king's portion, the idea that a defined share of all captured wealth, in theory, 1/5, belonged to the crown by right. In practice, this principle was applied selectively and enforced intermittently, which is a polite way of saying it was collected when the king felt like it. Below the king came the great lords, who had their own claims over the men fighting under their banners and the spoils those men produced. A knight who captured an enemy soldier was expected to declare that capture to his lord and accept whatever share the lord's customs prescribed. The details varied enormously by region, by period, and by the individual relationship between lord and man, but the general principle was that the knight did not simply pocket everything himself. There was always someone above him with a prior claim, and that someone had the authority to enforce it, at least in theory, and at least when he remembered to. Then there was the church, which approached the question of battlefield wealth with its characteristic combination of spiritual concern and financial pragmatism. The possessions of the dead, in ecclesiastical thinking, carried obligations. A man who died suddenly on a battlefield had not had the opportunity to make proper provision for prayers for his soul, for donations to his parish, for the various spiritual services that the church provided in exchange for financial consideration. His heirs were expected to make these provisions on his behalf. His captors, if he had been captured rather than killed, were expected to contribute a portion of the ransom to pious purposes. Even the men who stripped the bodies were, technically, expected to acknowledge the church's interest, though the mechanics of how exactly a man with a stolen breastplate was supposed to work out his tithe on it were, let's say, left somewhat vague. Underneath all of this sat a piece of English law called Deodand, which deserves a moment of attention because it illustrates rather perfectly the spirit of medieval legal thinking on this subject. Deodand, from the Latin deodandum, meaning to be given to God, was the legal principle that any object that had caused a person's death was forfeit to the crown to be used for pious purposes. In theory, this applied to battlefield weapons. The sword that killed a man was, under Deodand, not the property of the man who had wielded it, but property of God, administered by the crown. In practice, this principle was applied almost entirely to peacetime accidents. A cart that crushed a farmer, a millstone that fell on a miller, and almost never to the organized mass violence of a battlefield, because if it had been applied consistently to warfare, the administrative requirements would have been so enormous as to be genuinely comic. But the principle existed, and occasionally someone with a grievance and a lawyer would invoke it. The Court Rolls of Norfolk from 1348 record a Deodand claim over a sword found in the possession of one William Godson, described as a tanner, on the grounds that the sword had caused the death of an unknown man. William Godson's response to this claim is not recorded. His continued appearance in subsequent tax records suggests he managed. What all of this meant for the peasant with the breastplate under his shirt was essentially nothing, and simultaneously everything, nothing, because the law did not speak to him directly. He was not a knight, not a lord, not a clergyman. The entire apparatus of battlefield property law had been constructed around the assumption that he was not a relevant actor. Everything, because the law's silence on his situation was not the same as the law's permission, and the men empowered to enforce those other claims had a well-developed interest in finding him if he had something they considered theirs. The law did not give him rights. It gave him, at best, a set of gaps. What he did with those gaps was entirely up to him. Getting the armor off the body was, in many ways, the easy part. It was physical work, certainly, and unpleasant work if the body was still warm, and extremely dangerous work if the wrong people happened to be watching. But it was finite. You bent down, you worked the buckles and the straps, you lifted, you carried, and eventually you were done. What came next required an entirely different set of skills. The ability to convert a stolen or disputed or legally ambiguous object into money, quietly, without attracting the attention of the people who believed they owned it. Medieval Europe had a system for this. It was not a formal system, and it did not advertise itself, but it was surprisingly efficient and remarkably widespread. The foundation of the secondary armor market was the armorer's trade itself. Every town of any size in 14th and 15th century England and France had at least one armourer, and the larger cities had entire streets of them. In London, the armourers concentrated around Cheapside and later gave their name to Aldersgate Street's neighbouring lanes. In Paris, the Rue des Armuriers ran through the heart of the right bank for most of the medieval period. These craftsmen made new equipment, repaired existing equipment, and bought and sold used equipment, and in practice, the distinction between a legitimate second-hand transaction and the quiet disposal of battlefield pickings was not always one that the armourer pressed too hard. An armourer who asked too many questions about provenance found that his supply of interesting and affordable used pieces dried up rather quickly. An armourer who did not ask enough questions occasionally found himself explaining things to a magistrate. The ones who stayed in business the longest had figured out exactly where that line was, and they walked it every single day. Beyond the armourers, there was the broader world of medieval second-hand trade, which was considerably more developed than is sometimes appreciated. The market for used goods of all kinds operated through several channels, including permanent market stalls, travelling merchants, itinerant peddlers, and the institution that performed roughly the function of a modern pawnshop, the pledge house, or in English, the Lombard, named after the Italian bankers from Lombardy who had pioneered the trade in northern Europe. A man could bring almost any object of value to a Lombard, receive a sum of money against it, and either return to redeem his pledge, or, if the money had proved more immediately necessary than the object, simply not. The Lombard would then sell the unredeemed item, making its profit on the spread between the loan and the resale price. Nobody at the Lombard asked where things came from. That was rather the point. The travelling merchants deserved particular attention because they were, in practical terms, the most useful channel for someone who wanted to sell something in a place where they were not known. A piece of armor sold in the village nearest the battlefield was a piece of armor sold to people who had possibly watched the battle and who certainly knew the faces of everyone for 20 miles around. A piece of armor carried 50 miles to the next market town and sold to a merchant who was himself traveling through was a piece of armor effectively laundered of its immediate history. The effort required was real, and it had its own risks. A man carrying a breastplate on his back attracted attention in ways that a man carrying nothing did not, but the distance was also protection, and protection was exactly what the seller needed most. There were also the great fairs, the periodic gatherings of merchants from across Europe that functioned as the wholesale markets of the medieval economy. The Champagne fairs in northeastern France were the most famous, drawing traders from England, Flanders, Italy, and the German lands to buy and sell cloth, spices, metals, and everything else that moved through the medieval commercial world. Military equipment circulated through these fairs in volumes that the surviving records only partially capture, bought in bulk by merchants who supplied armies and garrisons, and who were not, on the whole, fastidious about paperwork. At this level, the individual provenance of any specific piece was dissolved entirely into the flow of goods, which was precisely as useful to the people who needed it, dissolved as it sounds. None of this was invisible to the authorities. The guild records of English armourers from the 14th and 15th centuries contain periodic complaints about unregistered dealers underselling guild prices, which is a fairly reliable signal that a parallel market in cheaper, unprovenanced goods was operating alongside the legitimate trade. City ordinances in London, Paris, and several Flemish towns periodically required dealers in used military equipment to register their stock and record its origins, which is an equally reliable signal that such registration was not happening spontaneously. The market existed, everyone knew it existed, and the intermittent attempts to regulate it suggest that the authorities found it useful enough to tolerate and troublesome enough to occasionally pretend to address. A practical arrangement, in other words. And honestly, the Middle Ages basically ran on practical arrangements. We have been talking about armor as though it were the most valuable thing on a medieval battlefield. And in terms of raw weight-to-value ratio and ease of transport, it largely was. But there was another asset scattered across those fields that was, in many cases, worth considerably more than any suit of plate, and that was considerably harder to move quietly through the countryside without being noticed. A knight's destrier, his warhorse, was not merely an expensive animal. It was a piece of military technology, a trained weapon, and an investment so substantial that the men who owned them kept records of their value, insured them through bonds and pledges, and occasionally mourned them in terms that they reserved for very few human beings. The prices were extraordinary. A top-quality destrier in 14th century England could fetch anywhere from 20 to 80 pounds, and exceptional animals commanded more than that. The Black Prince's own warhorse, Morel, was valued in his 1376 household accounts at £130. One horse. More than a skilled craftsman would earn in 15 years. Morel, for his part, survived Poitiers and apparently retired comfortably. He was, in that sense, luckier than most. The horses ridden by the knights at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 represented, collectively, a sum of money that would have funded several years of a modest lord's entire estate. When those horses bolted, fell, or were captured in the chaos of an engagement, they represented the most immediately valuable portable asset on the field, if portable is the right word, for something that weighed roughly half a ton and had strong opinions about where it was going. The legal situation surrounding captured warhorses was, if anything, even more tangled than the situation surrounding armor, because horses occupied a specific and somewhat peculiar position in medieval property law. They were, on one hand, movable property, which in legal terms meant that they were subject to the same complex web of lords' claims, royal portions, and battlefield customs that governed everything else. But they were also, on the other hand, living animals with established values, known bloodlines in many cases, and the ability to be identified by people who had seen them before. A distinctive horse was not like a generic piece of plate armor. It had a face. It had, possibly, a name. You can see how this gets complicated. And the man who had owned it, or the man who managed the previous owner's estate, might well recognize it if it appeared at the wrong market at the wrong time. There was also the question of control. Plate armor, once removed from a body, went where you carried it. A warhorse went where it decided to go, and a medieval warhorse that had just survived a battle was not in a cooperative frame of mind. The chronicles of Agincourt, Poitiers, and the various engagements of the 100 Years' War all contain references to warhorses running loose on and around the battlefield for hours or days after the fighting ended, requiring considerable effort to catch and considerably more to calm. A common soldier who managed to secure one of these animals had, in theory, a small fortune on his hands. In practice, he had a large, frightened, highly valuable animal that required specialist knowledge to handle, specialist equipment to manage, and a plausible explanation for how he had come to possess it. Not everyone was equal to all three of those things at once, and that's being generous. The most practical solution for men without equestrian backgrounds and without the connections to move a horse through legitimate channels was to sell quickly and locally, accepting a price well below market value in exchange for speed and discretion. The buyers in these transactions were typically dealers who operated at the margins of the legitimate horse trade, men who bought without asking and sold at a distance, pocketing the difference between distressed sale prices and what the animals were actually worth to a buyer who did not need to ask where they came from. It was not an arrangement that favoured the original seller, but it was better than trying to walk a destrier 3 counties away on your own. And yet, occasionally, a man managed it properly. The 1,363 petition rolls of Edward III's court contain a reference to a Kentish labourer named Thomas Ate Woad, who presented himself before a local justice claiming ownership of a horse he described as having been found straying after the engagement at a tournament ground outside Canterbury, a tournament that had, several accounts confirm, ended in a genuine brawl with real casualties. Thomas Ate Woad's claim was, predictably, rejected, but the fact that he made it at all, through proper legal channels, with a lawyer's language and a straight face, suggests something rather interesting about how ordinary people understood the possibilities available to them. The gap in the law was real. The horse was real. The audacity was, apparently, also real. Theory is one thing, documents are another. So let's look at some actual people. The medieval archive, patchy and partial as it is, does preserve a small number of cases in which ordinary men walked away from battlefields carrying enough value to genuinely alter the trajectory of their lives. These cases are not easy to find. They exist in the margins of chronicles, in the footnotes of legal disputes, in the pension records of royal households, and the wills of men whose named assets do not quite match what we know of their origins. But they are there, and they are worth looking at carefully because they put flesh on the abstract economics we have been discussing. Begin with the English archers of Agincourt in 1415. Henry V's army at Agincourt consisted, in rough terms, of about 6,000 men, of whom the majority were archers drawn from the English and Welsh yeomanry. These were not aristocrats. They were free farmers, skilled tradesmen, the sons of minor landholders, men who had signed up for the campaign in exchange for wages, the promise of spoils, and the kind of adventure that looked more attractive from a distance than it did on the day. What they found at Agincourt, after the extraordinary violence of the battle itself, was a field, covered in the bodies of French nobility, some of the wealthiest men in France, wearing some of the finest armour produced in that generation, many of them accompanied by their personal equipment, their horses, and in several documented cases, their travelling jewel chests. The subsequent distribution of spoils from Agincourt was, by contemporary standards, genuinely transformative for a number of the men involved. Several English archers returned home to purchase land. The subsidy rolls of Shropshire for 1,420 record, one John Bennet, described in earlier rolls simply as a labourer, now listed as a freeholder with a messuage and 12 acres. The acquisition dated to after the King's War in France. John Bennet left no explanation. He did not need to. The timing was the explanation. This was the definitive medieval marker of permanent financial improvement, and the records show more men like him than the official histories tend to mention. More specific, and more remarkable, is the case of the Flemish infantry at the Battle of the Golden Spurs at Courtrai in 1302. This engagement, in which a Flemish militia of craftsmen and urban tradesmen defeated a French army of knights, produced what the chroniclers describe as an almost incomprehensible quantity of abandoned equipment. The French cavalry, rooted on terrain they had failed to scout properly, left behind hundreds of pairs of golden spurs, the symbolic mark of knighthood, along with the armour and horses of the knights who had worn them. The Flemings, who had won the battle against all reasonable expectation, collected the spurs and hung them in the Church of Our Lady in Courtrai, where they remained for decades as both a trophy and a reminder. But the spurs were the symbolic harvest. The real harvest was the armour, the horses, and the ransoms. And the surviving guild records of Courtrai and Ghent for the years immediately following the battle show a notable uptick in property purchases, business investments, and charitable donations by men from middling and lower backgrounds, in quantities that correspond rather neatly with what the battle would have produced for the men who fought it. There is also the quieter, less dramatic evidence of the English Inquisition's post-mortem, the legal inquiries conducted after a landholder's death to determine what he owned and who should inherit it. These records, preserved in large numbers at the National Archives in Kew, occasionally reveal men of surprisingly humble origins who had accumulated land and goods in amounts inconsistent with their station in the years immediately following major campaigns. The connection is not always stated explicitly, because stating it explicitly would have invited scrutiny that nobody wanted. But the timing is suggestive, and historians who have worked through these records systematically, the medievalist Michael Prestwich among them, have noted the pattern repeatedly. What is perhaps most striking about these cases, taken together, is not the wealth itself, but what the men chose to do with it. Land was the consistent priority. Not luxury goods, not ostentatious display, not the kind of spending that would attract attention in questions. Land was permanent, productive, and above all, respectable. A man who owned land was a different kind of man from a man who merely had money, and the medieval peasantry understood this distinction with an acuity born of long experience of being on the wrong side of it. The armour was converted into money, and the money was converted into land, and the land was the thing that actually lasted. The transformation happened in stages, over years, carefully and quietly, and by the time anyone thought to ask how a particular family had come to own a particular field, but the answer was buried under enough time and legitimate paperwork to be essentially unanswerable. Spoiler alert, it rarely ended cleanly. The cases that are visible to us tend to be the ones where something went wrong, a dispute over ownership, a challenge from a lord who recognized his dead vassal's breastplate on someone else's wall, a deathbed confession that found its way into a parish record. The cases that ended smoothly are largely invisible, which means the successful ones are systematically underrepresented in the archive. The real number of men who quietly converted battlefield windfalls into something lasting was almost certainly larger than the documents suggest. It always is. Everything we've discussed so far involves a degree of luck. The right battle, the right timing, the right body lying in the right patch of field at the right hour of the night. Most men who enriched themselves through battlefield spoils did so opportunistically, seizing a window that had opened without their help and would close just as indifferently. But there was another category of man in medieval Europe, the man who decided not to wait for the window to open by itself, who identified war as an industry, positioned himself inside it deliberately, and then worked it with the systematic patience of someone who had understood, quite early, that the real money in medieval violence was not in winning battles, but in surviving them repeatedly and keeping careful accounts. These were the mercenaries, and in 14th century Italy, they reached a level of professional sophistication that has not always received the credit it deserves. The condottieri, from the Italian condotta, meaning contract, were the commanders of hired military companies who sold their services to the city-states of northern and central Italy in exchange for fees that were, by the standards of the time, genuinely spectacular. Florence, Milan, Venice, the Papal States, and a dozen smaller powers were in more or less constant competition with each other, and in more or less constant need of professional soldiers to pursue that competition. The condottieri supplied those soldiers, negotiated the terms of their deployment, and over time developed a relationship with their employers that was considerably more complex and considerably more profitable than a simple wage arrangement. The economics worked like this. A condottiere signed a contract, the condotta, specifying the size of his company, the duration of service, the daily rate per soldier, and the terms governing spoils. The spoils clause was always the interesting part. Standard practice gave the commander a substantial share of everything captured in the field. including ransoms, horses, armor, and equipment, over and above his contracted fee. The 1,377 condotta between the city of Florence and the English captain John Thornbury, preserved in the Florentine State Archives, puts a precise number on it. Thornbury's company would receive full wages, a bonus on contract renewal, and 1/3 of all ransoms, horses, and equipment captured in the field. 1/3. On top of the salary, on top of the bonus. A successful campaign could therefore produce income several times the base contract value, and a very successful condottiere managed multiple campaigns in sequence, building capital, reinvesting in better equipment and larger companies, and negotiating from an increasingly strong position with each successive employer. It was a business, a proper one. Cash flow, capital expenditure, reinvestment cycles, exit strategies, the whole thing. And the exit strategy, in most cases, was land. No case illustrates this trajectory more completely than Sir John Hawkwood, who began his working life as the son of an Essex tanner, served as an archer or man-at-arms in the early campaigns of the 100 Years' War, and ended it as one of the wealthiest and most celebrated foreigners in Florence, with a fresco portrait by Paolo Uccello in the city's cathedral that still looks down on visitors today. Hawkwood arrived in Italy around 1360 at the head of a company of English and Welsh veterans who had been discharged after the Peace of Bretigny, and found, as discharged soldiers often do, that civilian life had not kept pace with their expectations. He spent the next 3 decades selling his company's services to every significant power in northern Italy, accumulating ransoms, spoils, and contracted fees at a rate that converted a tanner's son from Essex into a man who negotiated as an equal with popes and received a state funeral from the Florentine Republic in 1394. A tanner's son from Essex in the Florentine Cathedral. Go figure. Hawkwood was exceptional in his longevity and his political acuity, but he was not exceptional in his basic method. The free companies of France, the routiers who terrorized the French countryside between major campaigns, operated on the same financial logic, if with considerably less organizational polish. They were, in essence, the same spoils economy, operating without the formal contract structure, which made them more immediately dangerous and considerably less trustworthy as long-term business partners, but also more profitable in the short term for the men at the top of the hierarchy. Roger de Beaufort, whose free company operated in southern France through the 1360s and 1370s, is documented as having accumulated sufficient capital through ransoms and battlefield spoils to purchase several estates in his native Auvergne and endow a small religious house, which was the standard medieval combination of financial security and spiritual insurance. What all of these men shared, from Hawkwood at the top down to the anonymous archers who formed the base of every mercenary company, was a willingness to treat warfare not as an obligation or an adventure, but as an occupation with a financial logic that rewarded planning, patience, and the disciplined reinvestment of early gains. The peasant who stumbled across a battlefield windfall and spent it was common. The man who treated that windfall as seed capital for the next campaign, and the campaign after that, was rarer. But the latter is who we are really talking about when we ask how medieval men turned violence into something lasting. The armor was the beginning. Knowing what to do with it was the whole point. It would not be a medieval story without the church turning up. It never is. Whatever was happening in the secular world, trade, warfare, inheritance, crime, property disputes, the buying and selling of stolen breastplates, the church was there, positioned at the intersection of spiritual authority and financial opportunity, with a fully developed theological framework for why a portion of whatever you had recently acquired belonged, properly understood, to God. And since God was not available to collect in person, the church would handle it on his behalf. This arrangement had been running for several centuries by the time we reached the period we are discussing, and it had been refined to a level of institutional efficiency that would have impressed a modern revenue authority. Centuries of practice extracting money from people who feel guilty will do that. The primary mechanism was the tithe, the obligation to give 1/10 of all income and produce to the church. In theory, the tithe applied to everything, including the profits of war. In practice, the application of tithe to battlefield spoils was contested, inconsistently enforced, and subject to the kind of creative interpretation that tends to emerge whenever a tax is theoretically universal but practically difficult to audit. A soldier returning from campaign with a sack of equipment and a purse of ransom money was not, in the normal run of things, presented with a tithe collector at the city gate. But the obligation existed in principle, and the church was not shy about invoking it when the circumstances were favourable, which meant when the soldier in question was wealthy enough to be worth pursuing, and pious enough to feel guilty about not having paid. The more reliably productive mechanism was the indulgence, and this is where the church's relationship with battlefield wealth becomes genuinely fascinating in ways that go well beyond simple hypocrisy. An indulgence was a formal remission of the temporal punishment due for sin, issued by papal authority and available in exchange for specified acts of piety, pilgrimage, or, increasingly through the 14th and 15th centuries, financial contribution. The theological scaffolding around indulgences was elaborate and, to the trained medieval theologian, entirely coherent. To the man lying awake at 3 a.m, having just sold a dead knight's helmet and feeling some kind of way about it, the practical meaning was much simpler. You could pay to have your sins addressed, and the price was set by the church, and the church accepted payment in the currency of the realm. The records of several English and French dioceses from the 14th century show a marked increase in indulgence purchases in the months and years following major military campaigns, and the purchasers were not exclusively the wealthy. Among the documented buyers of modest indulgences in the aftermath of Agincourt, several were men of identifiably low social status, described in the records as labourers, husbandmen, and craftsmen, whose purchases coincided with what the campaign's timeline would predict for men who had participated and returned with something to show for it. The going rate in the Diocese of Winchester in 1416 was 4 pence for a standard indulgence covering the sins of a single campaign. 4 pence, about 2 days' wages. A remarkably accessible price point for the management of a guilty conscience. The church did not ask where the money came from. The theology of indulgences was not contingent on the moral history of the funds. Money was money, sin was sin, and the transaction addressed both. There were also the prayers for the dead, the chantry masses, and the various other spiritual services that the church offered to men who had killed other men and wished to make some provision for the consequences. A chantry, an endowment that funded a priest to say masses for your soul in perpetuity, or at least until the endowment ran out, was the premium product in this range, and it was expensive enough to be out of reach for most ordinary soldiers. But cheaper versions of the same basic service existed at every price point, from a full chantry endowment down to a single mass said by a parish priest in exchange for a few pence. The church had, in effect, productized the management of military guilt across an extraordinary range of income levels, which meant that the market penetration was essentially complete. The result was that a peasant who had converted a battlefield find into money, and who then spent some of that money on spiritual services, was participating in a circular economy of a particularly medieval kind. The violence produced the wealth produced the guilt produced the expenditure. The expenditure flowed back to the institution that had spent centuries developing both the theology of guilt and the financial infrastructure to monetize it. The church neither endorsed battlefield looting nor effectively suppressed it. It simply ensured that wherever money accumulated, some of it would find its way back through the confessional, the indulgence vendor, and the chantry priest. A comprehensive business model, centuries ahead of its time. We have been making this sound almost manageable. A battlefield, some bodies, a secondary market, a cooperative armourer, a church ready to process your guilt for a modest fee. A system, more or less, with moving parts that could be navigated by a sufficiently careful and patient person. It is time to correct that impression. The medieval battlefield after dark was not a market with inconvenient opening hours. It was one of the more specifically dangerous environments available to someone with no legal standing, operating in an era before antibiotics, before any meaningful concept of due process for the poor, and before the word rights had been extended to include people who worked with their hands for a living. The risks were not abstract. They were concrete, well-documented, and frequently fatal. Start with the most immediate risk, which was the men who were still alive. A knight in a damaged harness, lying face down in a field after a battle, might be unconscious, stunned, badly wounded, or simply exhausted and catching his breath. A peasant who approached such a man in the dark bent down to begin removing his armor and discovered that the knight's hand could still grip a dagger was not, shall we say, not in a position to file a complaint. Contemporary accounts from the aftermath of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt all record incidents of battlefield strippers being killed by men they had assumed were dead. The chronicler Jean de Venette, describing the field at Crécy in 1346, mentions 2 men found dead near a pile of partially stripped armor, with no wounds consistent with the battle itself. Draw your own conclusions. The assumption was understandable. It was also occasionally the last assumption they made. Beyond the personal risk from individual bodies, there was the organized risk from the people with legal claims to the field. Every major medieval commander stationed guards over the battlefield after an engagement, partly to prevent unauthorized looting, and partly to secure valuable prisoners who might otherwise wander off or be spirited away by competitors. These guards had explicit authority to deal with unauthorized persons on the field, and the range of responses available to them included summary execution, which was not merely permitted, but in many jurisdictions specifically prescribed for battlefield looting during active military operations. Henry V's order at Agincourt, mentioned earlier, was not an idle threat. Several men were hanged in the days following the battle, and the chronicles record the fact without particular editorial comment, which tells you something about how routine it was considered. Then there were the fellow opportunists, who represented a different category of danger, but a real one. The men moving through a battlefield in the dark were not, as a group, characterized by strong mutual trust or well-developed codes of professional courtesy. A man carrying a breastplate through a field at 2 in the morning could reasonably expect to encounter other men also carrying things, some of whom would conclude that it was easier to take what he had than to find their own. Violence between battlefield scavengers is poorly documented but clearly attested in the margins of several chronicles, where passing references to men found dead without apparent cause of battle cluster suspiciously in the days following major engagements. Survived the field, and the risks did not stop. A man carrying stolen military equipment through the English or French countryside in the 14th century was carrying something that the legal system, when it noticed, was disinclined to view as legitimately his. The statutes of Edward III and later English kings repeatedly addressed the question of military equipment found in the possession of persons without plausible military claims to it, and the penalties prescribed were serious: forfeiture of the goods, fines, imprisonment, and in cases involving equipment that could be identified as belonging to a specific lord or institution, potential charges of theft that carried capital consequences. The enforcement was intermittent, as enforcement always was, but intermittent is not the same as absent. And a man who had been unlucky enough to sell a recognizable piece to the wrong buyer could find himself explaining things in a court that had absolutely no interest in hearing about the financial pressures. That had brought him there. Tough crowd. And then there was disease, which deserves at least a sentence because it killed more men in the aftermath of medieval battles than the battles themselves killed during them. Battlefields were repositories of concentrated biological hazard. Decomposing bodies, contaminated water sources, opportunistic infections in existing wounds, and the various epidemic diseases that travelled with armies and lingered long after the armies had moved on. A peasant who spent several hours in close proximity to the dead, in the dark, handling clothing and equipment that had been in contact with blood, excrement, and the particular biological chaos of violent death, was a peasant who had exposed himself to things that no amount of careful financial planning could fully account for. Plague, dysentery, infected wounds, and the general category of illness that medieval physicians attributed to corrupt air all feature prominently in the records of the weeks following major engagements, and they were conspicuously democratic in their selection of victims. The armor could be sold, the fever did not negotiate. Right. So suppose our man actually made it. Suppose he survived the battle, survived the guards, survived his fellow opportunists, survived the walk home, and managed to sell the armor without attracting the attention of anyone empowered to take it back. He has money. The question that has been implicit throughout everything we have discussed now becomes explicit. How much money, exactly? And what could that money actually do for a man of his station in 14th century England or France? The answer is more precise than you might expect, because medieval economies kept records, and historians have spent considerable effort extracting purchasing power from those records. The picture that emerges is both more hopeful and more sobering than the romantic imagination of windfall wealth tends to suggest. Begin with wages, because wages are the baseline against which everything else must be measured. In England in the mid-14th century, a common agricultural labourer earned between 1 and 2 pence per day in normal times, rising to 3 or 4 pence during the acute labour shortage that followed the Black Death of 1348 to 1350. A skilled craftsman, a carpenter, a mason, a blacksmith earned somewhere between 3 and 6 pence per day, depending on the trade and the location. A day's wage for an unskilled man was therefore roughly enough to buy a cheap loaf of bread, a small measure of ale, and not a great deal else. Annual earnings for a labouring man who found work consistently through the year, which was not guaranteed, ran to perhaps 30 or 40 shillings, or £1.5 to £2. Against that baseline, consider what a modest windfall from a battlefield transaction could actually purchase. A serviceable cottage in a rural English village, not a manor house, not even a comfortable farmhouse, but a solid one-room dwelling with a hearth and a garden plot attached, could be had for between £1 and £3 in the mid-14th century. The 1,355 court rolls of the Manor of Fawncett in Norfolk record the sale of exactly such a cottage for 22 shillings. The seller was a widow in financial difficulty. The buyer was listed as Thomas Webby. His previous occupation is not recorded. His previous occupation is, I think, not difficult to imagine. A small strip of arable land in an open field village, enough to grow grain for a family with some surplus for sale, might run to between 10 shillings and £2 per acre, depending on location and soil quality. An ox, the essential draft animal for anyone intending to farm seriously, cost between 10 shillings and £1. A milk cow ran to between 5 and 10 shillings. A complete set of iron farming tools, ploughshares, harrow teeth, sickles, and the various smaller implements of agricultural life might total another 10 to 15 shillings for a man equipping himself from scratch. Now set against those figures the value of what a single battlefield transaction might produce. A good helmet, sold carefully through the right channel, might fetch 30 shillings to £2. A breastplate in usable condition, perhaps £2 to £4. A complete set of arm and leg defences, sold piecemeal over time, another £2 to £3 in total. A man who walked off a battlefield with a reasonably complete harness and converted it intelligently into cash, accepting that he would not receive full market value, that the transaction required discretion, and that some of the money would need to be spent on the practical problem of not being caught, might realistically net between £5 and £10 from the exercise. Call it £6 as a working figure. £6 in mid-14th century England was approximately 3 years of wages for a labouring man. It was enough to purchase a cottage outright, with money remaining for a cow, some tools, and a small parcel of land. It was, in other words, the material foundation of an independent peasant smallholding, not wealth by any meaningful definition, but a categorically different life from landless wage labour. The difference between a man who owned a cottage and a cow and the man who owned nothing was not merely financial. It was legal, social, and in the lived experience of medieval village life, it was profound. The first man had a stake. The second man had only his labour, which he could sell or not, and which the market could value or not, and which disease or injury could remove at any moment without notice or compensation. And look, I know that doesn't sound like much. So when we talk about a peasant retiring on a dead knight's armour, we are not talking about luxury. We are not talking about feasts and fine clothing and the kind of visible prosperity that attracted the wrong sort of attention. We are talking about the specific, unglamorous, genuinely transformative difference between having nothing and having just enough. A cottage, a cow, a plot. A fire in winter. The ability to tell your lord's bailiff to find someone else for the worst jobs, because you could, if it came to it, manage without him. That was retirement, medieval style. It was not much. It was everything. Money and social rank were not the same thing in the Middle Ages. This sounds obvious, and in one sense it is, but the specific way in which they diverged in medieval society is worth examining carefully, because it runs counter to the assumptions that most modern people bring to the subject. We tend to assume that wealth produces status, that a man who has enough money can buy his way into any room he chooses. The medieval version of this story was considerably more complicated, considerably more resistant to individual ambition, and, occasionally, in ways that are genuinely surprising, more permeable than its official ideology admitted. The legal framework of medieval social hierarchy was explicit and formal in ways that the modern world is not. A villain, a serf, a man legally bound to his lord's land, did not become a free man simply by accumulating money. His legal status was inherited, attached to his birth and his land tenure, and it could only be changed through a formal act of manumission by his lord, which was a legal document requiring the lord's voluntary consent, and typically a payment substantial enough to compensate the lord for the loss of his customary rights over the man's labour. The price of manumission in 14th century England ran from a few shillings for a lord who was motivated to grant it, to several pounds for a lord who was not. The manumission record of one Robert Ate Forde, dated 1,359 inches, the rolls of Bury St Edmund's Abbey, records a payment of £3 and 4 shillings for his freedom. £3, roughly the value of a decent helmet. Robert Ate Forde apparently thought the trade was worth it. A man who had acquired battlefield wealth suddenly had the means to purchase his own legal freedom, which was a transaction so fundamental to his circumstances that everything else discussed in this chapter depended on it happening first. Above the question of legal freedom sat the question of social respectability, which was both more permeable and more resistant than the law. The English word gentleman had, by the late 14th century, acquired a reasonably specific social meaning. A man of free birth, landholding, and sufficient income to maintain a household without manual labour. The crucial word is landholding. Land was the material basis of gentility, and land could be purchased. A man who had converted battlefield wealth into a freehold property of sufficient size, say a messuage and 20 acres in a prosperous county, was not automatically a gentleman, but he was standing on the lowest rung of the ladder that led there. His son, if the land was maintained and added to, might credibly claim the designation. His grandson, if the pattern held, would be assumed to have always been one. This was the mechanism. Slow as anything, took generations, but real. The historical record contains several documented cases of families whose rise from peasant origins to minor gentry status can be traced across 3 or 4 generations, beginning with a sudden and unexplained acquisition of land in the generation that coincides with a major military campaign. The Paston family of Norfolk, whose remarkable collection of private letters from the 15th century survives in the British Library, began their documented rise with Clement Paston, described in a hostile account as having been a good plain husbandman who tilled his own land, and whose grandson William Paston became a successful lawyer and royal judge. The hostile account, written by a political enemy, is actually the most reliable evidence of the family's origins, because it was written specifically to diminish them. What it inadvertently confirms is that within 3 generations, the question of origins had become politically relevant, which means the family had risen far enough that someone thought it worth attacking. The church offered an alternative pathway that was in some respects more direct, because ecclesiastical advancement ran on education and patronage rather than land and birth, and the church had both the motivation and the infrastructure to identify talented men of humble origins and advance them. A boy from a labouring family who demonstrated academic ability and found a patron willing to pay for his schooling could, in principle, rise through the ecclesiastical ranks to positions of genuine power and influence. John of Gaunt's chancellor, Walter Scurlaw, who became Bishop of Bath and Wells and later of Durham, was the son of a Yorkshire husbandman. His trajectory depended on a combination of exceptional ability, fortunate patronage, and the church's chronic shortage of educated administrators, but it was not unique. The church was, in this specific and limited respect, the most genuinely meritocratic institution in medieval Europe. That is a low bar, but it was a real one. What all of this suggests is that the official ideology of fixed and permanent social hierarchy was somewhat more porous in practice than in theory, and that the porosity increased at exactly the moments when large quantities of military wealth were circulating through the economy. Wars disrupted hierarchies. They killed lords, redistributed land, created vacuums that needed filling, and injected wealth into levels of society where it was not normally present in usable form. The men who positioned themselves to take advantage of those disruptions were not breaking the system. They were using the system's own gaps, the same way they used the gaps in the battlefield property law, the same way they used the gaps in the church's moral framework. The gaps were always there. The question was always who had the nerve and the patience to walk through them. We began with a body in a field. Let us end there too, because the image contains more than it first appears to. A man is lying face down in the mud somewhere in northern France or southern Scotland, or the flat plains outside Courtrai, wearing 60 pounds of steel that took a craftsman 3 months to make. Another man is standing over him, in the dark, with a decision to make. He has perhaps 40 seconds before someone with better legal standing to be on this field comes close enough to see him. He is cold, he is probably injured. He has a family somewhere, in a village whose name no chronicle will ever record, and that family is going to need to eat through a winter that has not yet arrived. The math is not complicated, the risks are not invisible. He begins with the buckles. What this story is actually about, underneath all the armor valuations and the ransom figures and the legal history, is the question of how ordinary people navigate systems that were not designed with them in mind. The entire apparatus of medieval battlefield law, the royal fifth, the lord's claims, the church's tithe, the guild regulations, the statutes against unauthorized possession of military equipment was constructed by people who assumed that the relevant actors were knights, nobles, commanders, and kings. The peasant was supposed to be invisible in this framework, a background element, present but not participating. And yet the peasant participated constantly, systematically, and with a practical ingenuity that the formal record only partially captures precisely because it was designed to exclude him. There is something worth sitting with in the specific nature of the opportunity. It was not a petition, not an appeal, not a request for fair treatment from a system that had never offered it. It was the identification of a gap in the system's attention, combined with the willingness to move through that gap quickly, quietly, and without asking permission. The medieval peasant who stripped a battlefield was not optimistic about the system. He was not waiting for it to improve. He had assessed it with the kind of clear-eyed realism that comes from spending your entire life at the bottom of a hierarchy, and he had found the one moment when the hierarchy's attention was elsewhere: the battle, the darkness. That 4-hour window between the end of the fighting and the arrival of the people with legitimate claims to everything, that was it. That was the whole game, and he took it. The historian Barbara Tuchman, writing about the 14th century in her book A Distant Mirror, observed that the period was defined by the gap between the world as its governing classes imagined it and the world as it actually functioned. The chivalric ideal, the church's spiritual authority, the feudal order, all of these were frameworks that described how power was supposed to work, and all of them leaked, constantly, at the points where they met actual human beings with actual needs and actual ingenuity. The armor stripped from a battlefield was one of those leak points. It was not heroic, it was not celebrated, it left almost no trace in the official record. But it was real, and it happened constantly, and it was one of the few mechanisms through which the system's own wealth could be redirected, however briefly and partially, toward the people who had the least formal claim to any of it. The armor has changed, obviously. The specific opportunity, a field covered in expensive military equipment in a legal grey zone, accessible to anyone willing to work quickly in the dark, is not one that presents itself in quite the same form today. But the underlying structure has not changed nearly as much as we might prefer to believe. Every economic system generates surplus. Every system of law and regulation produces gaps between its stated intentions and its actual reach. Every period of disruption, war, plague, financial crisis, technological upheaval, redistributes wealth in ways that the formal mechanisms were not designed to anticipate, and creates windows through which people without formal standing can, if they are quick and careful and realistic about what is actually available to them, extract something meaningful from the chaos. The peasant understood this. He had no choice but to understand it. So the next time someone asks you how a medieval peasant could retire on a dead knight's armor, you have a real answer. Not quickly, not safely. Not cleanly, and not without risk, and not without the particular combination of nerve and desperation, and practical intelligence that life at the bottom of a medieval hierarchy tended to produce in the people who survived it. But it happened. The field was real, the armor was real, the gap in the law was real, and the 4 hours of darkness between the end of the battle and the arrival of the men with legitimate claims were genuinely, tangibly, sometimes life-changingly real. The peasant bent down. The buckles were cold. His hands were probably shaking. He worked them anyway, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he walked away.